Quick disclaimer, information in this podcast is for general informational purposes only and is not intended to be treated as medical advice. Always consult with your healthcare team before making changes to your diet, lifestyle, supplementation, or medication.
For years, butter has been blamed for heart disease and margarine marketed as the healthier choice. Is it time to challenge that old advice, especially if you're living with type 2 diabetes or prediabetes? Let's break down what the science really says.
Welcome to Type 2 Diabetes Talk, the place where we chat about what really works to treat type 2 diabetes and prediabetes naturally with nutrition and lifestyle. If you're looking to optimize blood sugar and A1C, lose weight, reduce medications, and improve your overall health, this is the place to be. Now, here's your host, Type 2 Diabetes Nutrition Specialist, Dr. Jeddah.
Hello, Dr. Jeddah here, and welcome to episode 91. Today we're tackling a question that still stirs confusion in many kitchens. Should you use butter or margarine? This topic came into my radar when Doug, one of our members, asked, "I've been using Smart Balance instead of butter because I thought it was better for cholesterol. But now I'm wondering if I should switch back to butter. What's actually better when you have diabetes?" Such a great question, Doug, and one that many people have asked over the years. Whether you love a slather of butter on your veggies or you've been avoiding it for decades, this episode will give you the science that can help you make an informed, confident choice. Let's rewind for a moment because this whole butter debate didn't start yesterday. Back in the 70s, public health guidelines started pointing the finger at saturated fat as the villain behind rising rates of heart disease. And since butter is high in saturated fat, it was quickly labelled as something to avoid. At the same time, guess what happened? Margarine, made from vegetable oils, was mass-produced and promoted as the heart-healthy alternative. Food manufacturers jumped on this message and began producing all kinds of margarine products, often loaded with hydrogenated oils that created something called trans fats. Trans fats, we later learned, are far worse than saturated fats. They increase inflammation, raise LDL cholesterol, and lower HDL cholesterol. Basically, the worst of both worlds when it comes to heart disease. And while many of those trans fats have since been removed from margarines, the legacy of confusion around fats, well, that still lingers today. Meanwhile, butter remained cast in a negative light for decades, even as new evidence started showing that not all saturated fat is created equal, and that real food sources of fat, like butter, might not be harmful at all. Fast forward to now, and we've got a much better understanding of how fats actually affect our bodies, especially when it comes to blood sugar, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes. Despite this, marketing messages haven't quite caught up. Margarine is still often labelled as heart healthy on the supermarket shelf, even if it's made with refined oils that can actually fuel the very problems we're trying to avoid. Here, we don't rely on opinion. We base our advice on solid scientific fact. It's the only thing we can rely on because of these silly inbuilt narratives that are so deeply ingrained in our society. And it's important to challenge the status quo, think outside the square, because many of these deeply ingrained narratives that most people believe to be true are actually keeping people sick, not making them healthier. Let's take a closer look at butter and margarine, what these two spreads actually are and what they're made from. Butter is a natural whole food. It's made by churning cream or milk, which separates the fat from the liquid. The result is a smooth, rich product that contains a combination of saturated fats, small amounts of monounsaturated fats, and a variety of beneficial compounds like fat-soluble vitamins A, D, and K2. If the butter is from grass-fed cows, it may also contain small amounts of omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid, which has been shown to have anti-inflammatory effects. Importantly, butter contains 0 carbohydrates, so it doesn't spike your blood sugar, and that's a big plus when you're working to manage diabetes or insulin resistance. And of course, again, butter is a natural whole food. Margarine, on the other hand, is not a whole food. It is made by taking vegetable oils, usually from canola, soybean, sunflower or palm oils, and putting them through industrial processes to make them solid. Originally, this process involved full hydrogenation, which produced those harmful trans fats we just spoke about. Today, margarine formulas have changed, but they are still highly refined and often include ingredients like emulsifiers, flavourings, preservatives, and colourings. They are a processed food. They're not a whole food. So even if they no longer contain significant trans fats, they often use oils that are rich in omega-6 fatty acids and prone to oxidation, both of which can increase inflammation and contribute to insulin resistance.
Don't spend months or years trying to work out how to treat your diabetes. With Dr. Jetta's VIP online membership, you'll have trusted support wherever you are at your fingertips whenever you need it. Access detailed guides to understand exactly what to eat. Explore the huge members library. Receive delicious weekly meal plans and join monthly member check-ins for personal feedback and accountability. Learn more and join as a VIP member today. Visit type2diabetestalk.com/programs.
Before we move to examine the science, let's bring in a real example of margarine versus butter from one of our community members. Doug, who we just spoke about, wrote in to say he was using Smart Balance Original instead of butter. He mentioned he probably made the switch at some point because of concerns around cholesterol and heart health, and of course he also found it easier to spread. So what's actually in Smart Balance? Let's look at the buttery original spread, which is made up of 64% vegetable oils, predominantly canola and palm oils. One of the primary messages on the label is it supports healthy cholesterol levels. Now, just to be clear, the product itself has not been proven to lower cholesterol. This is a blanket statement, and when you dig in a bit deeper, you see that the claim is, and I quote, Smart Balance supports healthy cholesterol levels that are already within the normal range when used instead of butter as part of a healthy diet that is low in saturated fat and that includes exercise and other physical activity. So that's a quote directly from the website to support that claim about cholesterol. And wow, that really changes our perspective of it, doesn't it? It's only if your cholesterol is in a healthy range and you eat a low saturated fat diet and do exercise that this margarine may be beneficial to your health. Very interesting. The reality is eating Smart Balance doesn't actually lower cholesterol, and there's no science to prove that. While it's marketed as heart healthy, the reality is that it is still an ultra-processed food made from oils that are not ideal for metabolic health. And even though it might be lower in saturated fat compared to butter, that doesn't automatically make it a better choice, especially when you're looking at the bigger picture of blood sugar, inflammation, and long-term health. And that's why we're going to explore what the science really says. First, let's just point out that the large majority of evidence comes from observational population studies, not randomized control trials. These types of studies can't prove anything. They can't state that butter causes heart disease, for example. They can only show a potential association. And what's interesting is that most of these population studies show no adverse effects of eating butter, despite what we might see or hear in news headlines. One of the most recent and important studies comes from the Framingham Offspring cohort, and it was published in May 2025. This was a long-term study following over 2,000 people for nearly 2 decades using detailed food diaries and rigorous health assessments. What they found might surprise you, and it's the complete opposite to what we'd expect given our thoughts about butter being bad. So what the researchers found was that people who ate more than 5 grams of butter a day over a teaspoon a day, had better insulin sensitivity, higher HDL cholesterol, and lower triglycerides. But here's the most striking result. Those who ate more butter had a 31% lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes compared to those who ate little or none. That's not a small difference. That's a meaningful reduction in risk. Of course, there's lots of other factors that could influence this, but it's an interesting observation. On the flip side, people who consumed higher amounts of margarine, specifically more than 7 grams a day, had a significantly increased risk of both cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. In fact, the risk of developing diabetes was 41% higher for those who consumed more margarine. So it's important to note that some of this data was based on margarines that were higher in trans fats, but still, this study challenges the old idea that we should be avoiding butter to protect our hearts or blood sugar. In reality, it suggests that butter in small amounts may actually be beneficial, or at the very least, not harmful. And that makes perfectly good sense because butter is a natural whole food that has been eaten for centuries by different cultures and different people around the globe. And it's not only this study that's saying these things. Another study from 2024 looked at different dairy products, and in terms of butter, they assessed 17 observational studies that surveyed butter consumption. The majority of studies found no association between butter intake and body weight, no association between butter intake and incidence of type 2 diabetes, no association between butter intake and fasting or postprandial blood glucose, A1C or insulin concentrations, no association with major cardiovascular events, and that's an important one. In terms of cholesterol, the results have been mixed, as some studies have shown butter intake was associated with higher LDL and total cholesterol levels, while others didn't. But that, in and of itself, doesn't mean anything, as we explained in detail in episode 42 on understanding cholesterol. Another major meta-analysis by Pimpin and colleagues titled "Is Butter Back?" looked at over 600,000 participants across multiple countries. The results showed that butter consumption had a neutral effect on heart disease, no significant impact on stroke, and a slight protective effect against developing type 2 diabetes. To emphasise, the study found no strong evidence linking butter consumption to heart disease or overall risk of dying. Now, it's worth noting these results don't mean we should all start slathering butter on everything, but they do mean that butter, especially as part of a whole food diet, is not the health villain it's been made out to be. And the story gets even more interesting when we look at the source of the saturated fat itself. What's often missing from the conversation is this: not all saturated fat behaves the same way in the body. Dairy products are a great example of this. The dairy fat matrix refers to the structure and packaging of fats within dairy foods like milk, cheese, yogurt, and butter. Unlike isolated fats or processed oils, dairy fat is part of a natural complex structure that includes not just saturated fatty acids, but also monounsaturated fats, short and medium chain fatty acids, phospholipids, and fat-soluble vitamins. And these aren't just structural features. They play a role in how the fat is digested, absorbed, and used by the body. Researchers have explored this in detail, looking at nearly 60 studies published over the past 10 years, and found that regular fat dairy products, including butter, were generally not associated with worse outcomes for obesity, insulin resistance, or cardiovascular disease. In fact, in some studies, full-fat milk and yogurt were linked to improvements in body composition. Cheese was associated with better lipid profiles. Butter, being more concentrated in fat, showed mixed results, but again, no strong evidence of harm when consumed in moderation as part of a whole food diet. What this review really highlighted is that the food matrix, the combination of nutrients, structure, and bioactive components can influence how that food affects our health. So even if butter is high in saturated fat, the way that fat is delivered to the body makes a difference. That's very different from the fats found in something like margarine, where oils have been refined, stripped of their natural structure, and often oxidized in the process. These refined oils don't come with protective compounds you find in dairy fat. They also tend to be much higher in omega-6 fatty acids, which, when consumed in excess, can promote inflammation. So the message here is not just about butter being safe, it's about understanding that butter, as part of a real food matrix, may be metabolized and utilized differently than isolated or heavily processed fats and oils. This is especially relevant when you have type 2 diabetes or prediabetes because blood sugar control, insulin sensitivity, and inflammation all play central roles in your long-term health. Choosing fats that support your metabolism and avoiding those that disrupt it can make a real difference. Before we move on to talk about what all this means to you practically, let's hear a testimonial from one of our members.
Bronwyn said, "My health has improved in all areas. Lower blood sugar, lower A1C, and I've lost weight. I really love the resources and their quality, plus lots of variety in the meals. Thanks for doing a great job and helping so many."
At this point, you might be thinking, okay, I get the science. It sounds really interesting, but what do I actually do when I'm at the supermarket or preparing a meal? Let's start with spreads. If you're choosing between butter and margarine and you're managing diabetes or prediabetes, real butter is generally the better choice. It's less processed, doesn't contain oxidized seed oils, and won't raise your blood sugar. It's a natural whole food source. Just use butter in reasonable amounts. And for most of us, that's how we tend to use butter anyway, in small to moderate amounts. It's not like we go and eat a whole slab of butter at one sitting. When you can, opt for unsalted or lightly salted butter, and if it's available and within your budget, grass-fed butter is a great option. It tends to have a slightly better nutrient profile, including more omega-3s and vitamin K, which supports heart and bone health. Now, what about Smart Balance and other margarine-style spreads? If you turn over the label, and you always should read nutrition facts labels, you usually find a list of refined vegetable oils like soybean, canola, and palm oil. These are still heavily processed, even if they're marketed as heart healthy. You might also see some margarines labelled as olive oil and think they are a healthier option, but unfortunately, these tend to be the same. Take Earth Balance extra virgin olive oil buttery spread as one example. It contains a natural oil blend of palm fruit, canola, safflower, flax, and extra virgin olive oils. So olive oil isn't even the primary ingredient in this olive oil spread. And with any liquid oil, it has to go through a refining process to make it spread, to make it firm. And that leads to oxidation of the oil, which is not good for any of us. Some margarines have added plant sterols, and there is research showing plant sterols can help with cholesterol, but you can get plant sterols from vegetables, nuts, and legumes. You don't need to eat margarine in place of butter for healthy cholesterol levels. Your overall diet and the state of your metabolism will determine that. The key is to limit refined fats and oils that have gone through industrial processing. That includes most margarines, especially those with vague labels like vegetable oil blend. If you see the word hydrogenated, that's a red flag. Put it back. So to summarise, butter is a perfectly acceptable and often better choice than margarine, especially when you're building a diet focused on real minimally processed foods, which is the perfect combination for prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. You don't need to avoid butter, and you certainly don't need to fear it. Remember, just because there's a deeply ingrained dominant narrative that suggests margarine is healthier, things are not always as they seem. The most important thing is not to get lost in the fat versus fat debate. What matters most is the quality of the food you eat, not just the number on the label or some marketing tactic that a label presents to you. When it comes to spreads, choose real over refined. Choose nourishment over marketing. And trust that small, simple swaps like using butter instead of margarine can make a meaningful difference when they're part of a consistent whole food approach. Because that's the key thing. It's the quality of your overall diet that's going to make the most difference to your health overall. And Jenny asked what spread I use, and you can probably guess. It's certainly butter. The fact is, a natural whole food will always be a better choice than a man-made processed food. It doesn't matter which way we try to paint it or sell it to the public. Take care until next week. Dr. Jetta, over and out.
Thanks for tuning in to Type 2 Diabetes Talk. Please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform. And for episode replays, episode notes, and more, visit type2diabetestalk.com. New episodes are available Tuesdays, 10 a.m. US Eastern Time, or your time zone equivalent. Thanks again. We're truly grateful to be a part of your life and help make a real difference.